Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 9, Lesson 5 of our Shirley English Grammar books or language books. To review what we learned in Lesson 4, we started learning about quotations, quotation marks, and explanatory words. Quotations, as you know, are direct words or specific words spoken by a person. We use quotation marks to punctuate the beginning and the end of those quotations, and the explanatory words give us an understanding of who is speaking and how they're speaking. Are they yelling? Are they whispering? Are they shouting? Are they just telling? And who is it who is doing the yelling or shouting or telling? So as we have been learning how to punctuate those correctly, and remember there were 4 steps to the punctuation of quotations, we are now going to move into dialogue. Now, this is just an added rule that goes along with those 4 steps that we did for punctuation of quotations. Okay, so if you need a review of that, you can jump back to lesson 4 of our chapter 9 video and review that in the Shirley Grammar book. Let's move on though to dialogue. So dialogue is a conversation between 2 or more people, and this is something we do every day. Probably not as much now that we're more isolated, but definitely something that we do every day. And this is where we are still using quotations. We're still working with quotations and quotation marks and explanatory words, but we're going back and forth in a conversation. Right now, I'm not having a conversation with you guys, but there are lots of conversations that we have every day or that we read about or even see as we're watching movies. So this is an important thing to know. The only thing that we add on to our 4 steps for punctuating quotations is that we are going to indent. So we're learning about indentation. We are indenting if more than one character is speaking. We indent or create a new paragraph each time the speaker changes. And we're going to go over that in just a second. So if you look in your Shirley English book under lesson 5, you're going to see that dialogue is a conversation between 2 or more people. And that in writing dialogue, we still use our quotation marks and our explanatory words just as we would normally, just as we learned last lesson. But now, if more than one person is speaking, as we go back and forth with those characters or with those people, we're going to indent with each new person. So you'll see an example of a dialogue in your Shirley English book. But I also am going to go over this one, and it's just a portion of a conversation. So you'll see that this is how our quotations have been written out in our books and on our classroom practices. So we're going to start from scratch here. We're going to read through, we're going to check for the correct indentations, and then we're going to go right through our 4 steps. Okay, we have Tim, did we get our birthday cards from Grandma? Asked Kim. Tim replied, that's kind of confusing. They are, they rhyme. So Tim replied, no, and I was sure they would come today. So let's think about who is speaking. In this first part, Tim, did we get our birthday cards from Grandma? Asked Kim. Well, we can see right there that we have an explanatory word, asked. Who asked? Kim asked. So in this first sentence, Kim is the one speaking. Okay, let's make sure, because we have an indentation here and then a new one here, let's make sure that Kim is not also speaking here. Let's go through this. Tim, see, that's going to get you. Tim replied, no, and I was sure they would come today. So Tim replied. Replied is another explanatory word. So we have Tim speaking in this one. So we have a quote from Kim and a quote from Tim. So notice that these are indented just as we would do with new paragraphs. Okay, so we have our indentation down. We can see now that this is one quotation from Kim and one quotation from Tim. So now we're going to go back to what we learned last lesson, and we are going to put in our correct punctuations. So remember, step 1 is to place quotation marks at the beginning and end of what is being said. Okay, Tim, did we get our birthday cards from Grandma? Asked Kim. So because this is our explanatory word, there is our quotations. Okay, so this is our quote. Tim, did we get our birthday cards from Grandma? Also in step 1, we're going to make sure that there's a comma at the end of the quote before the quotation marks. So actually I'm going to move these a little bit just so we can tell for sure that this comes beforehand. And then we're going to put a period after the explanatory words. Okay. Tim, did we get our birthday cards from Grandma? Asked Kim. But what we need to do here is what? Now we need to capitalize the beginning of a quote and any proper nouns or the pronoun I. Okay? Before we do that though, let's look at this. If we go back to our notes in lesson 4, we will see that if a quote is a question, we're going to use a question mark. So do we need this comma? Kim is asking a question. So we're going to fix this punctuation. We always want to look at that as well, okay? And then we're going to go back through and capitalize. Well, Tim needs to be capitalized for several reasons. First of all, because it is the beginning of a sentence. Second, it is the beginning of a quote. And third, it's a proper noun. Tim is his name. So Tim, did we get our birthday cards from Grandma? Asked Kim. Kim is our other proper noun, so we're going to change that to Kim. And then remember that we also need, in this next step, a punctuation for the rest of the sentence. So we're going to check and make sure we don't need any more punctuations. And we do. Kim is talking to Tim, so because she is directing her conversation or her statement to, or in this case, question to Tim, we need to put a comma here. Let's check just this quote. Tim, did we get our birthday cards from Grandma? Asked Kim. How does that look from everybody? Well, let's change Grandma also to a capital letter, because if we look at this, it's not from our grandma, but it's from Grandma. In this situation, this is her name. This is what they call her, is Grandma. So now we have finished this first quote, okay? So here's our indentation. This is what Kim says. Now we're going to indent again, just like we learned with our dialogue this morning, and we're going to continue on with this one here, with this quote. So we're going to go back to our steps. We're going to place quotation marks at the beginning and end of the quote. So we have Tim replied, no, and I was sure they would come today. Okay. We're going to put a comma at the end of the quote, right? Before the quotation mark, before the explanatory words, or at the end of our quote. In this case, our explanatory words are at the beginning. So we're going to put our comma to separate our explanatory words right here in front of our quote. Now, that means that we also need a period here, right? No, and I was sure they would come today. So now we have done all of our quotation marks, right? Quotation marks and punctuations. Okay, then we're going to go back and do our capitalization. Tim needs to be capitalized. Tim replied. No needs to be capitalized because it's the beginning of the quote, and that looks horrible. So let me fix that real quick. All right, so then we have no. So I'm going to come this way because I'm right-handed. No. Ha! Funny. Anyway, you guys know what I'm writing. No, and I was sure they would come today. Well, we have I, which is the pronoun I, so we're going to make sure that is capitalized. So now we have all of our capitalization, and now we need to go back and punctuate the rest of the sentence by checking for any apostrophes, periods, or commas that we may need to make within the sentence. Well, when we have something like no, and I was sure they would come today, we are going to put a comma, okay? This goes back to several things that we learned over the course of our grammar lessons or our language lessons. When we have a statement like no, it can be considered two different clauses where we would need a comma and a conjunction. All right, so let's go back through and make sure that we are set, because that is step 4, is to check the pattern of the quote. Tim replied, no, and I was sure they would come today. We have our explanatory words being separated by a comma. We have our quotation marks on the beginning and end of our quote. We have our capital letter, our capitalizations where they need to go, and our punctuations to end our sentence. So this is how we write dialogue. Now, as you continue on, you are going to see that you have a classroom practice today that's going to help you learn or help you study this indentation part and practice the indentation. And as you go through also in your book, you're going to see some examples, either a guided practice or an example of the dialogue that you're learning. This is it for today. So thank you very much, guys. I hope you have a wonderful day. And I'm going to walk over here and hit stop on the record button. Have a good day, guys.